The winter of 1883 came down on the Dakota Plains like a hammer. It was a cold that did not just bite, it gnawed. It was a physical presence, a weight that settled in the bones and stayed there, a constant, unwelcome guest in every cabin, every heart. The land itself seemed to shrink under its power, the vast prairie grasses frozen into a brittle, white sea. The wind was its voice, a relentless howl that scoured the landscape, carrying ice crystals that felt like tiny shards of glass against any exposed skin. For the settlers of Prairie Ridge, a small, hopeful cluster of log homes huddled against a shallow rise, this was not their first such winter. But memory had a way of softening the edges of the last one, leaving them unprepared for the raw, unblinking brutality of the present. Their cabins were built the way their fathers had built them, and their fathers before that. The method was scripture, passed down through generations of axe-wielding men who had carved lives out of the wilderness. You felled the straightest timber you could find, you notched the logs tight, and you sealed every conceivable gap with a thick daubing of mud, straw, and lime. The goal was a fortress, an impenetrable wall against the outside. A cabin with no gaps was a good cabin. It was the only way. Any man in Prairie Ridge would tell you that. A tight wall was a warm wall. It was simple, undeniable logic. Yet, the logic failed them, year after year. The cold did not knock before it entered. It seeped in like a thief. It found microscopic fissures in the chinking, places where the frozen mud had shrunk and cracked away from the wood. It poured through these invisible cracks not as a gentle draft, but as a sharp, piercing blade of air that could cut the warmth from a room in minutes. Frost would bloom on the interior walls, tracing the lines of the logs in delicate, deadly patterns of white. Families huddled around their cast-iron stoves, feeding them a constant diet of precious, hard-won firewood, only to feel the heat sucked away into the insatiable hunger of the winter. They were always chasing drafts. A man would spend his evenings pressing his hand along the walls, feeling for the telltale whisper of cold. When he found one, he would take a rag, or a bit of wool, or a strip of leather, and frantically stuff it into the offending crack, a temporary plug against a relentless siege. The next day, a new crack would appear a few feet away. It was a losing battle, a constant, wearying war of attrition fought inside their own homes. They burned through woodpiles that were meant to last until March by the end of January. They woke up to water buckets frozen solid, to breath that plumed in the air of their own bedrooms. This was survival, and it was a grim, exhausting business. Among them lived a woman named Ilara. She had arrived 2 years prior with her husband, a quiet man with thoughtful eyes and hands skilled with more than just an axe. He had been an engineer back east, a designer of bridges and trusses, a man who understood stress and pressure, expansion and contraction. But the promise of land had called to him, and he had brought his knowledge and his family west. A fever took him the first winter, leaving Ilara alone with their young son, Liam, and a set of journals filled with precise drawings and calculations that no one else in Prairie Ridge could understand. Ilara was an outsider, a widow with no man to build for her, regarded with a mixture of pity and suspicion. She was quiet, observant, and spent more time reading her husband's journals than she did gossiping at the settlement's single dry goods store. The pity began to curdle into something else when, in the late summer, she announced her intention to build a new cabin before the first snow. The men of the community offered their help, as was custom. Silas, the settlement's most respected builder, a man whose cabins were considered the tightest and strongest, stepped forward to lead the effort. It was then that the trouble started. As Silas and the others began laying the first course of logs, Ilara stopped them. She walked over to the foundation stones, holding one of her husband's journals. "Thank you for your help," she said, her voice clear but soft. "But I will be building this differently." She pointed to a diagram in the book, a cross-section of a log wall. Silas squinted at it, his brow furrowed. The drawing was strange. It showed logs stacked not flush against each other, but with a deliberate, uniform space left between each one.
"What is this, woman?" Silas asked, his voice laced with confusion. "These logs. There are gaps here." "Yes," Ilara said simply. "There must be gaps. A finger's width between every log, top to bottom." A silence fell over the small group of men. They looked from the drawing to Ilara, and then to each other. The idea was not just wrong, it was insane. To intentionally build gaps into a wall was to invite the winter in, to build a sieve instead of a shelter. It was a profound violation of everything they knew, of the fundamental law of survival on the plains. Laughter broke the silence first, a short, sharp bark from one of the younger men. Soon, others joined in, a chorus of disbelief and mockery. "Gaps?" Silas repeated, his tone shifting from confusion to condescension. "You want us to build you a house full of holes? We are trying to keep the cold out, not pipe it in directly to your hearth." He shook his head, a dismissive, paternal gesture. "Your grief has clouded your mind, Ilara. This is folly. Your husband was a clever man, I'm sure, but his books are for bridges, not for homes. Wood and mud, sealed tight. That is the way." Ilara stood her ground. She did not flush with anger or embarrassment. She simply closed the journal and looked at the men, her gaze steady. "My husband understood how materials behave. Wood swells with the damp and shrinks in the dry. The earth itself freezes and heaves. Your chinking cracks because it is fighting the wood. The wall must be allowed to breathe." The word breathe was the final straw. A breathing wall. The concept was so absurd, so contrary to their hard-won experience, that it became a joke on the spot. "A breathing wall," one man chuckled, slapping his knee. "Perhaps it will snore in a blizzard." The men gathered their tools, their offers of help rescinded. If she was determined to build this monument to foolishness, she would do it alone. "You will kill yourself and that boy," Silas said, his voice low and final, a pronouncement of doom. "When the first true cold comes, the wind will slice through those gaps like a knife. Your fire won't be able to keep a candle lit. You will freeze in a house of your own making." He turned and walked away, the other men following, leaving Ilara and Liam standing alone beside the foundation stones of their impossible cabin. The laughter echoed for a moment before the wind carried it away. They called it Ilara's sieve from that day forward. The work began the next morning. Ilara was not a large woman, but she possessed a quiet, unyielding strength, born of necessity and grief. She had watched her husband work, had learned the language of the lever and the fulcrum. With a system of ropes and a sturdy tripod of poles, she and young Liam began the slow, arduous task of raising the walls. She did not work with the brute force of the other builders. Her movements were measured, precise. Each log was selected, shaped, and hoisted with painstaking care. The most peculiar part of her process, for any who bothered to watch from a distance, was the measuring. After each log was settled into its notches, she would take out a small, carved piece of wood, a spacer, exactly the width of her index finger. She would place it between the newly laid log and the one below it, ensuring the gap was perfect, consistent from one end of the wall to the other. To the occasional observer, it was a ritual of madness. She was building effort into her own failure, meticulously crafting the flaws that would destroy her. While Ilara worked on her sieve,
The rest of Prairie Ridge prepared for winter in the usual way. Silas was building a new cabin for a newly arrived family, and his work was a model of the community's accepted wisdom. His logs were massive, hewn to fit so tightly that a knife blade could not be slipped between them. The moment a section of wall was complete, his sons would immediately begin the chinking, forcing the mixture of mud and grass into every seam with a vengeance, creating a solid, seamless barrier. They finished in half the time it was taking Ilara. Their walls were thick, solid, and impenetrable. They looked at Ilara's gapped structure, rising slowly across the prairie, and shook their heads in grim satisfaction. They had done it the right way. Ilara's innovation was not just in the gaps, but in what was to fill them.
In the weeks she spent raising the logs, she and Liam also gathered her materials. They harvested sphagnum moss from a shaded creek bed, bushels of it, which they laid out to dry. They dug clay from a specific deposit her husband had marked on a map, a kind that was finer and more elastic than the common mud. And they collected animal hair, bartering for it from the trappers, handfuls of coarse bison and deer hair. Her process was a kind of alchemy. She shredded the dried moss, mixed it with the clay, water, and the animal hair, creating a thick, fibrous paste. It was this concoction that she would use to fill the gaps. The principle, as her husband had written, was borrowed from the ancient shipbuilders. The moss was a spring. It would compress when the logs swelled with moisture in the autumn rains, and expand to fill the space when they shrank in the deep, dry cold of winter. The clay was the binder, and the hair was the reinforcement, a web holding it all together, preventing it from cracking and falling out. Her wall was not a rigid, fighting barrier. It was a flexible, living skin. She worked through the autumn, her hands raw, her muscles aching. Liam, only 10 years old, worked beside her, his small face set with a determination that mirrored his mother's. He helped mix the chinking, his small hands kneading the clay and moss, and handed her tools as she worked on the scaffolding. They spoke little, their efforts a silent communion of purpose against a backdrop of community disapproval. The children in the settlement were forbidden from playing with Liam, warned away from the fool's cabin as if its foolishness were a contagion. The isolation was a cold of its own, a chill that settled long before the first frost. By the time the first snows dusted the plains, her cabin was complete. From a distance, it looked almost normal, but up close, it was deeply strange. The lines of her special chinking were wider, softer-looking than the hard mud seals on the other homes. It didn't look strong. It looked vulnerable. Silas made one last visit, a final, almost pleading attempt to make her see reason. He stood before her finished wall, running a hand over the strange, springy material. "It's not too late, Ilara," he said, his voice more weary than angry. "We can still plaster over this with proper mud. We can seal these gaps before the real cold sets in. Think of the boy." "The boy is why I built it this way," she replied, her voice unwavering. "This will hold. It is designed to hold." He looked at her, at the certainty in her eyes, and saw not wisdom, but a stubbornness so profound it bordered on madness. He turned away without another word. The community had offered its wisdom. She had refused it. Now, the winter would be the final judge. The verdict, they all believed, was already written. The winter began its assault in earnest in mid-November. The temperature dropped steadily, and the wind picked up its mournful song. Inside the cabins of Prairie Ridge, the annual battle began. The first cracks appeared in the chinking. Men cursed and stuffed rags into the holes. The stoves were fed, their metal sides glowing a dull red, but the warmth never seemed to reach the corners of the rooms. The cold was a relentless pressure, a physical force pushing its way inside. In early December, the sky turned a strange, bruised gray. The wind fell silent,
an eerie, unnatural hush that put everyone on edge. The old-timers knew the sign. It was the calm before the fury, the deep breath before the scream. The great storm arrived just after dusk. It did not come gradually. It descended like a collapsing wall. The wind struck with a physical blow, a deafening roar that swallowed all other sounds.
Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, scouring torrent of white that erased the world. This was no ordinary blizzard. It was a polar vortex, an Arctic hurricane that swept down from the north with unprecedented ferocity. The temperature plummeted to depths the settlers had never experienced. It was a cold that killed. It was a cold that broke things. It broke axles, it broke tools, and it broke the rigid, brittle chinking on every cabin in Prairie Ridge. Inside Silas's home, considered the warmest in the settlement, the family huddled together. The wind screamed through the walls. With a sound like a pistol shot, a long section of chinking between two logs cracked under the extreme cold and fell to the floor, leaving a gaping hole. A blast of Arctic air shot into the room, instantly extinguishing a lantern on the far table. Silas scrambled to stuff the hole with a wool blanket, but it was like trying to dam a river with a handful of sand. The cold poured in. Soon another piece fell, and then another. His fortress was being dismantled from the outside in. The drafts were no longer whispers, they were shrieks. The family was wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces pale in the flickering light of the stove, which devoured wood with terrifying speed. The story was the same in every home. Panic began to set in. The woodpiles were dwindling at an alarming rate. The walls, which were meant to be their salvation, had become their enemy, sieves that let in the killing cold. The men who had laughed at Alara's breathing wall were now desperately trying to plug the dozens of new, unwanted breaths in their own. They were cold, they were frightened, and their faith in the old ways was cracking and falling away, just like the mud on their walls. Inside Alara's cabin, the world was different. The roar of the wind was muffled, a distant, frustrated howl. It beat against the outer walls, but it found no cracks to exploit, no rigid edges to shatter. The structure was not fighting the storm, it was yielding to it. The logs, shrunk tight in the deep freeze, had pulled apart slightly, but the moss and clay mixture had expanded perfectly to fill the space. Her wall had exhaled with the cold, maintaining its seal. There were no drafts, not a single one. Liam slept peacefully in his small bed, warm under a single quilt. Ilara sat in a rocking chair, mending a shirt by the light of a steady, unwavering lantern. The air was calm. The warmth from her small stove was not a desperate, fleeting thing. It was a gentle, even presence that filled the entire one-room cabin. She was using less than half the wood of her neighbors, the fire burning with a slow, steady efficiency in the still air. Her creation was being tested by the worst the world could throw at it. And it was working. The storm raged for 2 days and 2 nights. On the third morning, the wind finally began to subside, though the cold remained, a deep and bitter presence. In the gray light of dawn, a figure emerged, stumbling through the high drifts. It was Silas. His face was gaunt, his beard caked with ice. He had spent the last 48 hours in a state of frantic, freezing desperation. His wood was almost gone. The temperature inside his home was barely above freezing. He was not checking on the widow out of concern. He was driven by a sliver of desperate, unbelievable hope. He had to see. He reached her cabin and pounded on the door, his hand numb. The door swung open, and a wave of calm, steady warmth washed over him. It was so shocking, so utterly contrary to his reality, that he physically recoiled for a moment. He stared, dumbfounded. Ilara stood there, her expression calm. Behind her, he could see Liam sitting at the table, eating a warm bowl of oatmeal.
There was no frost on the walls. The air did not stir. It was a sanctuary. He stumbled inside, his eyes wide with disbelief. He walked the perimeter of the room, pressing his chapped, frozen hand against the walls. He felt nothing. No cold, no drafts. He looked at the chinking, the soft, fibrous material that he had mocked. It was intact, a perfect, unbroken seal. He turned to look at Ilara, his face a mask of awe and shame. All the pride, all the certainty of a lifetime of doing things the right way, crumbled to dust in that warm, quiet room. He had been wrong. So profoundly, dangerously wrong. "How?" he finally whispered, his voice hoarse. Ilara did not boast. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply gestured to a chair by the stove. "Sit," she said. "Get warm." Her triumph was not in his defeat, but in her son's safety, in the quiet hum of a principle proven true. Her victory was the warmth itself, and she offered it to him freely. He sank into the chair, the heat soaking into his frozen body, and he felt the sting of tears in his eyes. He, the master builder, had nearly frozen his family to death in his perfect, tight-walled cabin, while the foolish widow was living in gentle comfort in her house full of holes. When the storm had fully passed and the people of Prairie Ridge began to emerge, the news spread not by word, but by sight. They saw the smoke rising from Ilara's chimney, a thin, lazy plume, the sign of a slow, efficient fire. From their own chimneys, smoke billowed frantically, the sign of a stove being fed constantly just to keep the cold at bay. One by one, driven by curiosity and a dawning sense of dread about their own failing homes, they made their way to her cabin. Each visitor had the same reaction. They would step across the threshold and stop, stunned into silence by the wall of warmth. They would look around, their eyes tracing the impossible, draft-free walls. The men who had laughed the loudest were now the most silent. They touched the strange chinking with a reverent curiosity. They felt the steady, radiant heat. They saw the truth, and it was warm. The laughter was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling quiet. It was the sound of an entire community realizing their bedrock beliefs were wrong. A few days later, Silas returned. He did not come seeking warmth this time. He came seeking wisdom. He stood before Ilara, his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the floor. He was a proud man, and the words came hard, but they came with the weight of sincerity. "I was wrong," he said, the admission hanging in the quiet air. "My family, we almost—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a humility she had never seen in him before. "What you have done here, it is not folly, it is wisdom." He paused, swallowing his pride. "Teach me." The request was simple, direct, and profound. It was a surrender and a plea. It was the moment the entire community's future shifted. Ilara retrieved her husband's journal. She did not hoard her knowledge or ask for payment. She opened the book on the small wooden table and began to explain. She spoke of the nature of wood, how it was a living thing even after it was cut, expanding and contracting with the seasons. She explained the failure of a rigid system, how the mud chinking fought the wood until one of them had to break, and in the deep cold it was always the mud. She showed him the drawings, explained the role of the moss as a spring, the clay as a seal, the hair as a binding web. She called it a flexible seal for a dynamic wall. She explained that the gap was the most important part, for it gave the materials room to do their work. It was not a hole to let the cold in. It was a space that allowed the wall to keep the cold out, permanently. Silas listened, his head bowed in concentration. He was no longer the master builder, he was the student. He asked questions, not of doubt, but of detail. He traced the diagrams with his finger, his mind slowly grasping the elegant, powerful logic of it. That spring, the sound of construction in Prairie Ridge was different. It was the sound of rebuilding, but also of unlearning. Under Elara's quiet guidance, the community began to retrofit their homes. It was a humbling, laborious process. Men who had built their cabins with their own hands now had to systematically undo their own work, chipping out the cracked mud they had once applied with such pride. Silas was the most dedicated of them all. He worked alongside Elara, mastering the technique, learning the feel of the new mixture, the precise way to pack it into the gaps. He became her first and best disciple. Soon, the entire settlement was filled with the sight of men and women gathering moss, mixing clay, and carefully applying the new, living chinking to their homes. The landscape of their survival began to change, one finger-width gap at a time. Elara's sieve was no longer a term of mockery, it was a term of respect. They started calling it the Prairie Seal, or the Breathing Wall. The following winter came, as it always did, with a vengeance. But this time it was different. The cold laid siege to Prairie Ridge, but the walls held. The drafts were gone. The stoves burned with a calm, steady heat. The precious woodpiles lasted. Inside their warm, quiet cabins, families lived with a security and comfort they had never known. The constant, gnawing anxiety of the cold was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding peace. The children no longer had to sleep in their winter coats. The war against the winter had been won, not by fighting harder, but by thinking smarter. The story of the breathing walls of Prairie Ridge began to travel. A surveyor passing through was stunned by the warmth of the cabins and took the idea with him to new settlements farther west. A writer for a territorial newspaper wrote a small article about the Widow's Wall that defied the Arctic winds. The knowledge spread, not like a wildfire, but like a quiet, growing seed, passed from one builder to another, a piece of practical wisdom that saved lives and changed the way people lived on the frontier. The innovation was never named after Elara, not officially. It simply became the new, right way to build, its origins a local legend, a story told on long winter nights. Elara never sought credit. She remained a quiet member of the community, respected and admired, but never placing herself above others. Her victory was not in being right, but in the shared warmth and safety of her neighbors. She had faced down the scorn of her community and the fury of the natural world, armed with nothing more than a dead man's journal and her own quiet resolve. She had proven that true strength was not in rigidity and brute force, but in flexibility and understanding. The harshest winters teach the deepest lessons, and the lesson of Prairie Ridge was one of humility. It was a lesson that wisdom can be found in the most unexpected places, in the quiet words of an outsider, in the strange drawings in a book, and in the simple, elegant logic of leaving a little room for things to breathe. The legacy of her work was etched into the very logs of the town, a testament to the idea that tradition should be a guide, not a prison. The most enduring structures are not always the ones that resist change, but the ones that are designed to adapt to it. In a land of unforgiving extremes, a quiet widow had taught a town of proud men that the best way to withstand the pressure of the world was not to build an unyielding wall against it, but to create a barrier that understood the grace and necessity of yielding. It was a lesson they would never forget, a quiet truth that kept them warm for generations to come.